Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're going to lead with Frank Gifford, who died recently at the age of 84. Hey, what can you say about Frank Gifford? He was one of the greatest New York Giant football players of all time. In the 1950s, when the Giants were the toast of New York, he was the closest thing they had to a matinee idol. Came out of USC with blue eyes, chiseled looks. He was a great football player, by the way. All-American at USC, high draft choice for the Giants in 1952. He played halfback, but he also played some wide receiver and defensive back. He was the most valuable player in the league in the Giants championship season of 1956. Even today, he owns the Giants record for most touchdowns in a career, and he owns the NFL record for most touchdown passes thrown by a non-quarterback. He could throw the ball too. Then he went on to be a television pitchman. Then he became a TV sportscaster. And finally, he was one of the three premier hosts of Monday Night Football, along with Howard Cosell and Don Meredith. Quite a career. Here's the early part of his career as described by Chris Berman on ESPN.
On the field, Frank Gifford was known most for his versatility. He played defensive back for 2 years at the University of Southern California. Then in 1951, in his senior year, Gifford switched to tailback and became an All-American, rushing for over 800 yards and 7 touchdowns. But when the New York Giants selected him in the first round of the 1952 draft, his teammates were not ready to embrace the glamour boy, whose good looks had won him parts in movies while he was still in college.
I was out of the ordinary because I was from California, and my nose wasn't broken. I had all my teeth. I paid an enormous price for it, too, on the football field. I did within the Giants itself in the early days until I proved that I could hit back as well as I could be hit.
As a rookie, Gifford played several positions, including defensive back. In 1954, his third season, Gifford evolved into a triple threat under the Giants' new offensive coach, Vince Lombardi.
I could still see him running the halfback option pass. He did that as well as anybody.
In 1956, Gifford averaged over 5 yards a run and was voted the NFL's MVP as the Giants won the league championship.
Hey, by 1956, when the Giants won the NFL title, he was one of the toasts of New York. You know, Toots Shores, Frank Sinatra, Joe DiMaggio, and that. In fact, he shared his locker at Yankee Stadium with Mickey Mantle. So there you go, the biggest baseball idol and the biggest football idol in New York City sharing the same locker. Of course, in those days, that was enough to merit an appearance on What's My Line. This is just a couple of weeks before the NFL championship game. He comes in as F. Newton Gifford. His face wasn't that well known at that time. And here you hear Arlene Francis just lather up all over herself over Frank Gifford, while that coldfish Dorothy Kilgallen doesn't even know who he is.
Now it is time to meet our first contestant. So will you come in and sign in, please? F. Newton, if I may. Where are you from?
Bakersfield, California, John.
Bakersfield, California. Oh, that's wonderful country out there. Nice to have you here in the East. I trust you get to like it after you've been here for a while. I want you just to meet the panel very informally. That is the panel.
That's Mr. Gifford.
Yeah?
Is there anything athletic about what you do?
Yes.
Well, I should think so. Bennett wants me to ask you if you're all-star of the New York Giants, but I don't think I ought to ask you that. Is football in your line at all?
Yes.
Bennett, it's not Red Grange. Do you play pro football?
Yes.
From Bakersfield, he's all-star with the New York Giants, are you?
Just a country boy.
Are you all-star with the New York Giants? Fullback, halfback, quarterback? You got a lovely back. I don't care what condition it's in.
Bennett kept the mid, and I ought to find you. There wasn't any call for a conference now, Bennett, sir.
You've got the star of the Giants here. If we didn't know him, we'd be...
My son would raise such Cain with me. I'm glad that
it's
Bennett helped.
unbelievable. It's Frank Gifford, not Newton. Newton is his middle name. We thought we'd intrigue you with that one. But it's a most remarkable performance, Frank. I hope this doesn't embarrass you. In today's game, he ran for 2 touchdowns. He passed for 1 more, and he caught a pass for the last one. Is that right?
That's right.
And this is how the Washington Redskins went home pale and somewhat shaken.
Well, I think that Newton threw me.
Well, that's what, Stubby, we were hoping Newton would throw you. And
if he can throw me, it's a good throw.
Possible you, Stubby, in the middle of our line. He looks like a fine-sized man for a tackle.
I got news for you. With me, you'll only need 2 other guys in that line.
Now, I want to say one thing, Organs. I think the record should be complete on Frank. In 1952, you were named All-American when you were with the USC, right?
That's right, John.
Well, Frank, it's wonderful to have had you with us. We'll flip all these anyway because it's so much fun to have had you. And I'm sorry we didn't give him more trouble, and it's that Bennett Cerf. We'll get him. Thanks very much for being our guest.
Well, Gifford had great seasons in 57 and 58. He was part of the great 1958 championship game. Some people call that the greatest game ever played. And he played a key role in that game when he rushed and barely missed making a first down late in the game that would have had Giants keep possession of the ball. Instead, they had to turn it back to Johnny Unitas, who engineered a game-tying and then a game-winning drive in overtime for the Baltimore Colts. His career was interrupted in 1960 by the famous hit by Chuck Bednarik, whose podcast we did a couple of months back. In a game against the Eagles, Bednarik hit him as he was coming over the middle. Gifford was laid out for 10 minutes at the time. He had to miss the rest of the season and then miss the entire 1961 season. I've been reading his account of it, and interestingly enough, although most people call it a concussion, he calls it a spinal injury. And I think that's what it was when you watch the film of it over again. I don't know if we talked about that when we did Bednarik's podcast. It was probably spinal shock rather than a concussion. In any event, here's a little more from Chris Berman on how he came back after the 1961 season.
And after sitting out the 1961 season, the 8-time Pro Bowler was back in a Giants uniform the following year.
I missed it. I knew that I could play. I had more football I wanted to get out of my system. I loved playing in New York. I went back and I played 3 more years.
Giants were good in those years, but they lost to the Packers in the NFL Finals in 62 and to the Bears at Wrigley Field in 63, and Gifford hung it up after the 1964 season. Here's Giants.com.
Gifford finally retired from the Giants in 1964 and restarted a successful career in broadcasting, highlighted with his role as the play-by-play commentator for ABC's Monday Night Football.
As Frank Gifford, halfback, I spent 12 wonderful years with the New York Giants, many of those years winding up in championship games. Now, as Frank Gifford, sportscaster, I play an entirely different position.
Gifford was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1977, and his good friend Wellington Mara would fittingly introduce him.
Frank Gifford was one of the greatest players ever to play for the Giants. He added dignity, tone, and class to our entire operation. Even amongst stars, he was a standout.
Once a Giant, always a Giant. Get it right on the nose. I couldn't imagine not being a Giant. I was really blessed.
Gifford was one of the first great New York football icons who transcended the game. And almost 60 years later, he's still revered by the Big Blue faithful. This versatile player made the Pro Bowl on defense and offense in consecutive seasons, playing in 7 overall. The NFL MVP in the 1956 championship season. Hall of Famer number 16, Frank Gifford. After his playing days, Frank Gifford was one of the stars of one of the most popular television shows of all time, Monday Night Football. He was the voice of Monday Night Football. But throughout his post-playing days, Frank Gifford always embodied what being a New York Giant was.
Yeah, but Frank Gifford wasn't done. He started to do commercials, some pretty well-known ones.
Here's Frank Gifford, all-pro halfback. Hey, Joe, are you still using that greasy kid stuff on your hair? What else? Vitalis. That's what else.
Did some pretty famous calls in the Olympic series in the Winter Games in 1976 in Innsbruck.
Number 15, the greatest downhiller, many people say, of all time. Well, Frankie knows what he has to do because most of the tough competition has already gone ahead of him. Franz Klammer with an incredible race.
And of course, Monday Night Football, where he's the buffer between the obnoxious New Yorker Cosell and the down-home Texan Meredith. And we did Dandy Don's podcast a couple of years back.
The New York Jets versus the Green Bay Packers. ABC's NFL Monday Night Football is brought to you by Lincoln Mercury. Hello again, everyone. I'm Howard Cosell, and welcome to our first regularly scheduled NFL Monday Night Football game right here on ABC. We'll get astute observations on that during the course of the game from our resident expert on the Green Bay Packers. Nobody lost more critical games to them in the history of football than Don Merritt.
Thanks a lot, Howard. I'm not for sure of the winds from the north-northwest, though, but most of it was right. As you can see, Howard's ready, and the Green Bay Packers and the New York Jets are, too. It's going to be one of these games, and anything could happen. I happen to think Namath can throw against anybody. He's got some good folks to throw against tonight. It's going to be a good ball game. Frank has got a lot of more details than I do, folks. I'm going to bring in Frank right now to talk to you. Frank, what you got to say, buddy?
Well, I like what you say about Joe Namath. We remember him last year, our final Monday night telecast, when he really shook up Oakland, beating 25-46. We're looking for that kind of a game tonight.
Last thing I want to say about Frank Gifford is he also retains some renown in the literary world, not for what he wrote, but because he was a character in a great semi-autobiographical novel by the novelist Frederick Exley. Exley's first novel was called A Fan's Notes, subtitled A Fictional Memoir, but it recounted a young man just like Exley who was born in New York and went out to Southern California for college and was a classmate of Frank Gifford. While the protagonist struggled in college, he watched Gifford score touchdowns and date cheerleaders, and then they both moved back to New York City. And while Gifford was a media hero and football star for the Giants, the Exley protagonist struggled at life, but he remained a Giants fan, and so in a sense Gifford, his hero, both bedeviled him and bedazzled him in the book. It's quite a good book, and I recommend it to people as a sort of an existential look at Frank Gifford's life in the 1950s and the 1950s culture in the United States. We're going to move on now to Buddy Baker, who died recently at the age of 74, and Buddy Baker was a legend of NASCAR. He won the 1980 Daytona 500, and through his racing and then his television announcing, he helped popularize NASCAR throughout the country. He was a good old boy, and I'm going to let NASCAR.com tell his story.
Buddy Baker was 6 feet 6 inches tall, a big man, much larger than your typical race car driver. He had a big heart, too, and an easygoing demeanor that earned him the nickname the Gentle Giant. His other nickname, Leadfoot, came from his sheer, flat-out driving style. Born in Florence, South Carolina in 1941, Buddy was the son of Hall of Fame driver Buck Baker. It didn't take long for Buddy to follow in Dad's footsteps. In 1959, at the then tender age of 18, Baker made his first NASCAR Premier Series start. Over the next 35 years, he became a hero in his own right, with a career marked by success at NASCAR's fastest and most fabled racetracks. Baker was the first driver to go faster than 200 miles per hour in a stock car, breaking that mythical barrier at Talladega in 1970.
This is going to be a very big win. Buddy Baker takes it.
Later that year, he won the Southern 500 at Darlington.
I've wanted to win this thing since I was 9 years old. Now here I am in Victory Circle. It's just a country boy's dream comes true. Here I am.
For the next decade, Buddy scored victories in the most prestigious races NASCAR had to offer. The World 600 at Charlotte, the Winston 500 at Talladega, and the 1980 Daytona 500.
Waving like mad as he crosses the line. Buddy Baker has got it.
35 years later, still the fastest Daytona 500 ever. Leadfoot indeed. NASCAR's biggest race had eluded Buddy for 20 years, and in Victory Lane that day, a mixture of relief and pride dominated Baker's emotions.
Right now, I'd like to say a lot of things. I can't. I'm caught up in myself right now.
After 19 wins and 38 poles, Baker ran his last race in 1992, capping a model career that touched every milestone save the Premier Series championship. Buddy Baker gave us everything we could ever want from a race car driver, and so much more.
Well, I'm not a big NASCAR guy, but he was right up there with Cale Yarborough and Richard Petty. I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer and IT genius, Sid Tepps. We're going to close tonight with Billy Sherrill, who died recently at the age of 78, another good old boy. He was a record producer and a songwriter. He was sort of a Phil Spector of country music. He was originally signed by Sam Phillips at Sun. Then he went on his own. He worked with some of the greats, including Charlie Rich and George Jones, whose podcast we've done. But without question, his greatest work was with Tammy Wynette in one of the greatest country music songs ever written, if not the greatest. It may not be the greatest, but it's in the class photo. Billy and Tammy co-wrote it. The Blues Brothers sang it in their movie. It was used at the beginning of 5 Easy Pieces. And naturally, Hillary Clinton misinterpreted it in a famous interview.
You know, I'm not sitting here as some little woman standing by my man like Tammy Wynette.
Hillary, would you listen to the words? He needs her because he's just a man. He needs her forbearance and strength. Honestly, Hillary can be so clueless. It's a country feminist anthem, for God's sakes. Here's the classic written by Billy Sherrill and Tammy Wynette and sung by Tammy.